Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 12th of February, and in today's concise update, we're looking at Russian advances even deeper into Andriivka, pushing towards the western environs of the town. In addition, we'll look at clashes in Dakhnia, in Peshchane. Then we'll look northwards at the Zherebets River fronts, and we'll finish off with Kursk. I also promise that moving forward, especially tomorrow, I do want to go into a deep dive about the upcoming meetings between various officials from Russia, Ukraine, and the United States alike, and of course, the wider NATO array of prime ministers, defense ministers, and other officials that are within the organization that are part of the Munich Security Conference or a part of the meetings that are going on in Ramstein. So, we're going to look at all of that in tomorrow's video. We'll look at the order of those meetings, what are the key points, what public officials are telling the media, and what are their publicly stated intentions. But for today's video, I just want to look at a couple of the recent frontline changes, beginning with the Velyka Novosilka front. And you can see over here the Russian forces chipping away at territory a bit to the west of Ramivka along this horizontal paved road that pushes into the border region between Zaporozhye and Donetsk. This is also an area where you have a bit of a lack in trenches. The trenches that we publicly see based on satellite imagery are located 2 to 3 kilometers to the north. We discussed them in yesterday's video, and you could see that the Russians are taking advantage of a lack of a stable Ukrainian defense line further south in order to chip away at additional plots of open fields and forested patches. So over here it amounts to 1 square kilometer, and here a bit less, 31 hectares. And this is a part of the aftermath of a lot of the recent Russian advances that occurred in the latter portions of January on the Velyka Novosilka sector. Looking at a really important part of the front line, I would say it's actually one of the most contentious right now, sort of rivaling Pokrovsk and Kursk. It is the Andriivka front. So you can see over here the Russian forces to the east were able to capture territory, not necessarily within Dakhnia, but more so on the outer edges of the town, because the Ukrainians from the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, which recently replaced their commander, they are holding out with a really steadfast resolve in the basements of these houses here. And as a result, the Russians are opting to advance a bit further to the south and just try to chip away and make it as difficult as possible for the Ukrainians to move in and out through this narrow corridor in an effort to maximize Ukraine's attritional state in this location, and then also to eventually physically cut off this location. You could also see to the south that the Russians are beginning to push towards the vast swaths of open fields that still remain under Ukrainian control, that are acting as a buffer zone between the line of contact and villages like Zelenivka, Ulakli, and Konstantinopil. Over here, you can see the Russians captured 1.4 square kilometers of territory, but it could be even more because you have this video from February 12th of Russian assault squads, and the unit is not specified, but there are a couple that are potential candidates for this. You could see them located near Krakow on my map, and they launched assault operations westwards through these open fields, were able to dislodge Ukrainian forces from several tree lines, and then also forced the Ukrainians from this group over here of between 6 to 8 soldiers. I can't remember exactly how many, but it was a small assortment of forces, and they retreated on foot. They actually ran on foot westwards out of the pocket that you see me hovering over with my mouse right now. And so there is a pretty good chance that this location that I'm marking in red is no longer in Ukrainian hands, just simply due to how outstretched it is and disconnected from the main Ukrainian garrison. So this would be as a result of the recent Russian assault operations in this location, which are right now really being conducted with the hope of finally taking over all of the 2015 era trenches that were built on the western perimeter, in this case, of Kurakove, that includes trenches and anti-tank ditches. A bit to the north, though, you can see the Russian forces capturing 1.9 kilometers of territory just to the south of Shevchenko. And also, there is this plot of territory that includes several trenches that are a part of a wider array of defense networks built by the Ukrainians that really prevent a Russian penetration towards Andriivka from this northern flank. Clearly, we saw that did not help out in the end due to the lack of Ukrainian manpower holding out in these trenches, because even though the physical structures are important and they could slow down an armored operation if they're sort of done in tandem with mine laying operations and then combined defending with infantry and with drone elements. It simply was not done in any organized manner. And I warned about this for months upon months when the Russians were pushing into Slontsivka and into Slovyanka and Petropavlivka, because the writing was on the wall at that point. Because following the fall of those two villages, there was just this completely open route on higher elevation and on open fields with a clear road pushing southwards to Andriivka that the Ukrainians could not defend with any sort of strategic depth, because the only line of defense they had were the trenches. And if they did not have sufficient manpower and assault squads to hold on to those locations, then they would be exposed. And then you could see the Russians trickle in at a pretty fast pace to take over the entirety of the town. And that's what we're seeing occur right now. And so, besides the advances to the east and Shevchenko, which really are a part of a culmination process that is ongoing and will continue to occur over the next couple of weeks, in Andriivka itself, we see the Russians pushing even deeper westwards. We can see they were able to acquire 1.7 kilometers of an advance in the horizontal direction westwards and have nearly reached the western outskirts, the western gate, pushing to the towns of Bakhatir, Oleksivka, all the way, you could say, to the border between Dnipro and Donetsk. And in recent weeks, Bakhatir has turned into an impromptu Ukrainian organization point, because Andriivka previously served that purpose, but now it's being redesignated for Bakhatir. And Bakhatir sort of acts as a conduit between Komar and then Andriivka, and more generally, the 30 square kilometer pocket located to the east. And now that the Russians are advancing at such a rapid pace through the center of Andriivka, it really does pose a concern for the new Ukrainian elements that are making it to this town, that they will be the next to engage in frontline activities and in defensive fighting. Because if they are unable to retain control over here, the Russians will have an open route directly to the eastern flank of Komar, which is very important because of the significance of all the villages along the Mokriali River Valley, and because it would then give the Russians the opportunity to flank Novopavlivka and a bunch of other logistic nodes in Dnipro from the south. So that's something to look out for in the sort of midterm, but it all sort of starts with Andriivka falling in the first place. And you can see right now that the 3rd Battalion of the 46th Brigade, and more generally the entirety of that air assault brigade, is not doing enough on the ground to push back the Russians, because these Russian advances are occurring along a very narrow front, but nonetheless, they are still able to achieve deep advances because they're not actually enduring local counterattacks on the ground. And it's something that the Ukrainians are definitely capable of doing in certain respects. For instance, in Pischane, they definitely have proved they are able to take out local counterattacks. But at least in this specific case, the Ukrainians have been unable to muster the forces or the willpower from within their ranks to do that, even though it would help out and at least temporarily stabilizing the front line, so at least the fighting can drag out within the town itself instead of it just being taken over by the Russians in a matter of days. Because right now, that's what we're seeing. The Russians have almost entirely taken the center of the town, especially the key roads that run through the town. So the Russians are able to have a lot of mobility and moving from east to west, and the Ukrainians only remain in holdouts, either southwards, and that's being done so they can then provide a buffer zone for Konstantinopil and Olakli, where the Ukrainians continue to resist, or a bit to the north, where the Ukrainians are hedging with their positions in these trenches and on a local hill located a bit to the north. But when it comes to elevation, the Russians have so many other ridges and high points that it's all about the Ukrainians trying to muster up enough of these strong locations, these higher elevated regions, to at least be on parity with the Russian side. So all in all, the situation in Andriivka is looking very bleak, and I believe that we'll see additional advances in the coming days in that location. Now, a bit to the north, an area where the Ukrainians have been able to turn the tide is in Pischane due to the efforts of the Skala Assault Regiment and the 68th Jaeger Brigade, redirected from its positions about 10 kilometers to the east and has now been moved westwards to engage in this counterattack. So, what we know from geolocated footage is that the Russian forces have been pushed out of at least 0.7 square kilometers of territory, that the Ukrainians have been able to retake parts of the windbreaks, parts of residential areas in the town, and most of the industrial district. But the 74th Motorized Rifle Brigade, they claim to have retaken the entirety of the industrial district, including the Krasno Armianskaya Zapadnaya number 3 mine. And they have drone footage of a flag being raised in the southeastern corner to prove that. And that's proof to show that the Russians, at the very least, are in these buildings to the south, but it is not enough to prove that the entirety of the town is back under Russian control, despite the claims of some of those local Russian sources. We also have footage of the Skala Regiment taking POWs in Pischane on February 11th. And I believe it was like 4 or 5 troops taking POW, because what we see from the Skala Regiment and all of the Ukrainian garrison attacking over here is they utilize Bradleys to very quickly reach the line of contact and provide fire support. Then they dismount these squads, these highly mobile squads that are really well versed when it comes to frontline engagements, quickly entering and securing the perimeter of a stronghold, taking POWs as well. It's interesting because the Scala Regiment, on average, it has soldiers that are in their 40s and 50s, but it's just simply men that are in pretty good health and are, I would believe, highly motivated. That's why they are within this unit and are not located in some sort of regularly assigned infantry battalion that they were sort of mobilized for. And they have a certain level of experience that makes them stand out, and that's why they're assigned these offensive tasks in the first place. It's also why it was upgraded from being a regular group to being a battalion, and now into being a regiment that receives a lot of this Western style equipment that is needed for this sort of offensive activity going forward. And so Pischane, the capture of it by the Ukrainian side, or at least partial entrance, is creating a wedge and is preventing the Russians from focusing on deeper advances towards the outskirts of Pokrovsk from the west. So that is important. It's one of the reasons why the Ukrainians launched the attack in the first place. And now, when it comes to the Ukrainian perspective, they would hope that they'd be able to retain control over here and then gradually weaken the Russian flanks, fully push out the 74th Brigade's presence to the east and to the west, because to the west they do have these protruding positions that are extremely difficult to push them out of, and they are putting enormous strain on the rear in Zverevet and in Leontinovichi. And from there, Shevchenko would be the natural goal, because Shevchenko is a large organization point for the Russian forces in their efforts to then push westwards towards other villages that are on the sort of western flank of Pokrovsk. But also, it provides the Russians with an outlet to provide constant pressure for the Ukrainians that are defending the outer ring of the city of Pokrovsk from the south. So there are numerous reasons why the Ukrainians would have an interest in retaking it, but we don't yet have enough of an indication that the Ukrainians have built up a strong enough force to do so. So right now we're just going to focus on what's actually unfolding, and that's a local counterattack in one specific village. And so far, we're seeing the Ukrainians are holding on, but the situation could change. We could see over here in Kotlina, again, very similar situation where the Ukrainians are holding out with this outstretched pocket entering into the eastern part of the town. And even Deep State today actually claimed that the Russian forces were able to gain additional control outside of Kotlina in the fields to the north of it. I've already marked for several days now that it's under Russian control, so I'm not really going to adjust anything. But just so you guys know, there is a continued back and forth over there. But no longer are the Russian objectives maximalist, in the sense that they're not really looking right now at an immediate breakthrough to push northwards towards the E50 highway and towards Serhivka. They're more so looking at quelling the Ukrainian resistance in its entirety and taking control of key strong points, key dugouts and trenches that are on the perimeter of Kotlina, and also finally pushing the Ukrainians out of this eastern pocket, because it's really become a thorn in the Russians' back that is preventing them from continuing with their objectives of really expanding and blossoming out west of Pokrovsk. And that's all a part of why I explained in my previous video. That's the reason why the Ukrainians are even conducting these sort of attacks in the first place. And a bit to the north, or not really a bit, but significantly to the north, we're going to zoom in over here on the Zherebets River fronts, because we have additional footage from over here north of Balka, Zhuravka. So this is in an area near Makivka, where we all know about the Russian forces and their efforts to cross over the river. They were able to take the town over in its entirety, and since then have established a solid bridgehead that has not been repelled by the Ukrainians. Now, after months of building up over here, they've been able to basically double the size of the bridgehead overnight due to the capture of 4 square kilometers. And you could see over here on February 12th, the 66th Mechanized Brigade, they conducted FPV strikes onto houses where Russians were advancing through in the southern part of Makivka. And this was in an area very, very close to the Zherebets River. There is a singular sort of paved route. You can't even really see it here on the map, but it leads southwards towards the rest of the Ukrainian holdings near the river, including here Novolyubivka, and there are a few other positions that are located southwards. But once you reach an area like Novolyubivka, it's actually the final wedge point that separates the two bridgeheads that were established by the Russians to the west of the river. And it's absolutely critical that the Ukrainians retain control over these positions, because having a unified bridgehead would increase the connectivity between the various Russian parts of the front line and allow them to operate in unison to advance even deeper towards Ukrainian trenches that you can see are built along several layers. And you can see my mouse sort of hovering over them. And also, you could see, for instance, in an area like Nover Katerinivka, this is a local height that projects power onto the remaining supply routes to the west and onto the remaining open fields, because this is pretty sparsely populated area. And so it does provide a lot of local dominance for whatever side controls those locations. We'll obviously look at it more in detail as the Russians continue to try to expand control over here. And we'll do a topographic deep dive in the future. I have to zoom in on ongoing developments in Kursk. I want to show you guys this footage, which does indicate there was an additional Russian advance in Sverdlikovo. So you can see over here on February 12th, the 36th Marine Brigade, they dropped grenades onto Russian infantry that entered into Sverdlikovo. This has now become a consistent theme, so it is not just a transient Russian movement. They are definitely lodged in over here, not just in the forested patches, but also in populated areas, in houses. So individual Russian soldiers and also in small squads, they've been spotted over here and have been killed as a result of Ukrainian drone activity. But it is also an indication to us that they have been able to seep in over here. And actually, we haven't seen any footage of Ukrainian forces located in these areas. Definitely, there are Ukrainians in the southern part of Sverdlikovo because it is so close in proximity to the border with Sumy, but we just haven't seen ground engagements or attempts at counterattacks yet. And at this current moment in time, there still is a bit of a concern about the logistics and the corridor that the Russians are using to access Sverdlikovo, because it is a bit disconnected from the broader line, the more solid line the Russians have been able to establish about 2.5 kilometers northwestwards near Darino, Nizhny Klin, and the entire river line, and also just generally the trenches and fields south of Zeleny Shlach. Sverdlikovo, the fact that the Russians were even able to reach it was a bit of a bridge too far, so to speak. And the fact they've been able to retain control over it actually does speak positively towards their offensive activities over here. And it's absolutely critical for the Ukrainians to ensure that they do not cede control over this village, because then, by extension, all the holdings to the west in Kursk Oblast, including Nikolaevo, Dorino, and all of the border regions and anti-tank ditches, will then fall into Russian hands. And then you'll have a much stronger Russian flank to the east of this river body. I don't know which one it is. I don't think it's the Snagost River, but it's just a really important river, or I suppose body of water, that is separating the Russian front line. And then from there, the Russians would have access to the paved road leading directly into Suja, about 9 kilometers to the southeast. So it's absolutely critical for the Ukrainians to muster up not just the 36th Brigade, but also the other units that are located over here, including at least one battalion of the 225th Assault Regiment and the 116th Brigade. I know they're located around here to a certain degree, and they would be well served in conducting a localized counterattack over here to push the Russians out, and not just relying on drone activity to attrit the Russian forces, because this is about, creating sort of stopgap to prevent a deep Russian penetration, similar to what the Ukrainians are currently doing in Pischane, in trying to stall the Russian momentum in those locations. So I'll be really interested to see how the battle unfolds over here, because it could have significant implications more generally for the future of the Ukrainian holdings in Kursk and how large they actually are, which is actually very important for the course of negotiations that we will discuss in tomorrow's video. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next upload. Goodbye.